friends at CADMIS. So we will now move on to that content.
So on our agenda today, we're going to start out by giving a brief overview of the timeline of the program adoption and the policy, and then we'll take a look at the basics of how the SMART incentive works. Then we'll talk about the differences between the SMART program and the SREC program, and then we'll look at what municipal systems will look like under the SMART, and then we'll follow all of that with a discussion. So before we jump in, we're going to do a little survey to see where we're at right now. So if you go to pollev.com/MAPCMTG, like MAPC meeting, then you'll be able to respond to this next question. So we'd like to know, when people ask you about SMART, how comfortable do you feel explaining it? So you can click on the smiley face or frowny face that best represents how you're feeling currently, and our goal today will be to turn that frown upside down if that's where you're starting. Okay, so we're going to move on to our second question. If you click. Yeah, so this one you can still be on that website, or you can text it with your smartphone to MAPC. You can text MAPC MTG to 22333 to respond. So for this one, please tell us what types of resources you'd like to have on the SMART incentive to better understand it.
We're reading in some of the comments that folks that have tuned in over the computer rather than calling in by phone aren't right now able to hear us, but those that are calling in by phone are. So just to bear with us for a moment as we try to figure that out. I recognize that those connecting with the computer have not heard me say this, but in any case, give us just a second as we figure that out, and if you haven't yet responded to this question, either through the website or through texting, please go ahead and do so, and we'll be back with everyone in just a minute. Hi again, folks. So we're typing this in as well to the extent that we can, but we're hearing about some of these technical difficulties, primarily, like I said, that if you're on the computer, you might not be able to hear us. If you are able to hear us and are having some sort of difficulties, we recommend that you call in by phone. We'll type this in so the folks that can't hear us can do that. If you're having other difficulties and you're connecting by phone, do let us know again in the chat box, and we'll see what we can figure out. We're going to keep going for now, assuming that there are some folks that are able to both see and hear us. But if that changes, we'll let you know.
Okay, so I'm going to just give us a quick overview of the history of the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target Program. So that is what SMART is standing for. So here's a look at how we've gotten to where we are right now. So there have been a lot of different hearings, and some municipalities have even been interveners to more closely work on developing this program. And altogether, this has been a multi-year process to get to where we are right now. And many of you have participated in this in different ways, whether by writing comments or filing briefs or attending different hearings. The shorter timeline that we're looking at right now, the main thing to keep in mind is the SMART application launch, which will be on November 26th. And if that's our most important next step for this process. So please mark that date on your calendar. The other opportunities that we, potential opportunities we see for communities to participate in this discussion moving forward is at the 400 megawatt review. And if you're a community with a municipal light plant, then there's going to be a grant program opportunity notice issued by DOER for MOPs interested in running a program for under 25 kilowatt solar. So if you're interested in learning more about that or more about the policy pieces of this, the MEPC contact for you is Megan Aki, and her email is up on the screen. But again, the main takeaway for the timeline is November 26th, so that's when the application portal will be available. And that's very important if you have a project that you have almost ready to go. So let's talk about how SMART works in general, and I'll start mostly at the beginning. So the easiest way for me to understand how SMART works is to think about what we have right now. So with SRECs, we have for behind the meter systems, so a smaller building like a town hall, right now you have 2 meters. So you have your solar production meter, which is showing exactly what your inverter is showing for your solar system, so what you're producing. And then you have the net meter, which is interacting with your electric utility, which is showing what you're sending out to the grid and what's coming back in to be used by that building. So here, if we have 10 kilowatt hours of solar, 7 of that might be going into the building, 3 might be going out to the grid, and you might need to pull 1 back in from the grid to have a total of 8. So then your electric bill from your net meter would show what's going out to the grid, what's coming back in, and bill you on the difference. Then separately, when you reach 1 megawatt of solar production, you're getting an SREC, and that's going into the exchange market, and so you're getting that incentive as a market-based price for your production. So now this is how it changes when we're using SMART. So we still have these 2 meters. Now your smart meter is the one showing your production, and you still have your net meter installed. So instead of having that net metering show up on your bill or having the SRECs, instead you're taking that production, you're applying this smart rate. So now you have one rate where you know for the length of the system, for smaller systems 10 years, and for larger systems 20 years, exactly what that incentive will look like. So this is the easiest way for me to think about it. If this isn't the easiest way for you to understand it, please let us know and we can find other resources for you. but I think this gives a pretty good base of what's going on. So let's talk about how that SMART rate gets calculated. So there is a behind-the-meter calculator that is at this address, and this is what that looks like. So you can start plugging in some of these numbers for a project that you already have or a project you might be considering, and start to see what that SMART incentive might look like. Here's the basics of what that calculation is. So you take to get your SMART rate, you have the base rate, which is determined by your declining block. So that's what time do you apply with that project, the PV capacity, and who the off-taker is. And then you're subtracting a greenfield subtractor if that applies. So that's for larger systems, larger ground-mounted systems that aren't on brownfields, a cap landfill. If you have a project that's on new undeveloped land, then you might have to apply that subtractor. And then one of the things we'll be focusing on today are these adders. So you add the adders, but good to keep in mind, the adders also decline by 4% with each block, which is how the base rate is declining over the course of the system. So let's talk about these individual components. So for the land use categories, to determine whether you have this greenfield subtractor and what that amount is, your project will be in one of these three categories. So for category 1, if any of this list of system types applies, then you're in category 1. For the other two categories, if you do not fulfill any of these requirements and you are ground mounted with this larger capacity, so over 500 kilowatts and less than 5 megawatts. If you're above 5 megawatts, then that project doesn't qualify for the SMART incentive. Some good things to note here are that these larger systems that are on a brownfield, cap landfill, a piece of land that's already been developed or sited on a solar overlay district are all falling into this category 1, which is the preferred category to be in. And then if you're constructing on a greenfield that's also zoned for commercial or industrial use, then that's falling into category 2. So the zoning also has an influence on what category the project will be in. So then the other piece of this recipe is your base incentive. This is a simplified graph of what these base rates look like. There are multipliers in the real base incentive based on how large the system is, so the PV capacity and the off-taker. But the main takeaway here is that we have these 8 blocks, and as the blocks decline by 4%, your base incentive is getting less preferable. So time is of the essence for this program. This is what the larger chart looks like. So you can see that there are these multipliers if you have a smaller system that's also low income, or just a smaller system to begin with. As you get these larger PV capacity sizes, then you have these smaller multipliers. The other thing to note is the time of the incentive. So for smaller systems, you have a 10-year SMART program, and for these larger than 25 kilowatt systems, the program is for 20 years. The component that is really making the difference between different types of systems when we're thinking about is it worthwhile to install a solar parking canopy? Should we look at community shared solar? Are these adders? So this is a quick glance to compare what these adders look like. So the cents on the kilowatt hour for these different incentives. the important piece to keep in mind for the adders is that they come in 4 different buckets, and you can only pick one adder per bucket. So where this is coming into play for municipalities is that for location-based, building-mounted, brownfield, landfill, and solar canopy are all in the same category. So if you had a solar canopy on a brownfield, you can't double that incentive. So you want to think about which one will give you the bigger incentive for that bucket, if that's going to be a factor in what type of project you're looking to install. For the off-taker based, that's where public entity comes in, but you can see that this is a smaller adder than community shared solar or low income community shared solar. So you can't take both of those adders. For solar tracking, that will probably not apply. There aren't many systems that do use solar tracking. That's a pretty small adder. And then for energy storage, there's a different calculator that will tell you what that adder is. So let's look at what that looks like. So for the storage adder, there's a fairly complex equation that you're plugging in the ratio of the storage capacity to the solar capacity and the duration of the storage, and the outcome looks like this graph. So I've included the link to that calculator so that you can plug in some numbers and play with that a little bit if you're thinking about storage or already have storage as part of a project. The simplest way to interpret this graph is that the closer you got to 100% of the PD capacity with the storage capacity, and the longer the storage hours at that rated capacity, the higher your adder will be. And this is in graph form, the same thing that's in that chart, or vice versa, in chart form, the same thing that's in the graph. So you can see that as you get to this lower right corner, that's a much higher adder than you would start with at 25% of the solar capacity. The other piece I want to highlight for you is just where to go for the application portal. So this is masmartsolar.com, and this is what the portal looks like when you go there. Also on this website is some additional information about the program in general, some links to the different calculators, links to the DOER webinars that they've hosted, and those slides from there that are really informative. So this is a good place to look even before that opens. And then in terms of the application process itself, again, this is on November 26th that this opens. And for a window of time when the application first opens, all of the for all the projects that apply during that first window, they'll be treated with the same starting date, so that there will be more time to review those initial projects. The expectation is that there will be a lot of projects from the backlog being put into the portal right away. So there's a difference between how you're applying for these smaller, so smaller in this case again is less than 25 kilowatt systems versus the larger systems in terms of what paperwork you need to include in your application. You apply in PowerClerk the same way that you your developer would have been applying already under, if they're using SRECs and production meters. You get a preliminary statement of qualification, then the actual installation and interconnection happens, and then you're going back into the system to get this final statement of qualification, and then the actual incentive is starting. So this information is also on that same website. I highlighted it on the last slide. And now we'll talk in more detail about the difference between SMART and SRECs. And Greg from CADMIS is joining us to discuss that.
Thank you, Nicole. And yeah, everybody, my name is Gregory Hall, and I am a senior analyst at the CADMIS group. Cadmus is a strategic consulting firm, and one of our core practices is actually helping municipalities through solar procurement. So today, during the second half of this presentation, I'm just going to walk through, at a high level, how SMART impacts municipal solar development. I've seen one or two questions come in on the message chat, but do feel free to send those in. I'm going to try to speed through this so that we have plenty of time to discuss some of your project specifics. So one place we like to start when introducing municipalities to solar development under SMART is talking a little bit about the transition from SRECs to SMART and how that impacts solar development. One really important thing to consider when looking at solar in the SMART program is that the SMART program would not be designed the way it is if it weren't for the successes and some of the drawbacks of the SREC program. So where you really want to start is the form that the solar incentives will take under the SMART program. The SREC program provided, as Nicole mentioned, a market-based and volatile slash, the incentive was subject to market fluctuations based on supply and demand created by the Renewable Portfolio Standard. What SMART aimed to do was to bring down the total value of incentive, but fix the value so that financiers had more confidence in the revenue that their projects would generate. What this means is that, in general, the program provides less dollar value for every project, but there's more assurance in the long-term revenue of that project, and it's subject to less market volatility. The term of the SMART program differs by size, and that's based on the revenue requirements of solar projects in different sectors. So for residential systems and small commercial systems, the SMART incentive is available for 10 years, and for larger systems, that incentive is guaranteed for 20. And like we may have mentioned, it's a fixed incentive, and it's also important, especially when you're thinking about your municipality's ability to claim the environmental impact of the project. Through the SMART program, the electric distribution companies will be claiming all of the environmental attributes and RECs that are minted by a megawatt hour of production. So here's a brief overview of project economics under SMART. As we mentioned, the total incentive value is coming down, and in some cases that decreases in the 30 to 40% range. And what it's doing is it's replacing SREC's higher market-based incentive with a lower fixed incentive. Again, one major piece of feedback from the financing community, which is one of the drivers of solar development in the Commonwealth, is that SRECs, even though they were a higher value, provided enough risk in terms of their long-term volatility that they were actually harder to finance than if it were a lower fixed incentive. Another key feature of SMART, which I think is important to consider, especially when you're looking at different sites in your municipality or connecting your constituents with projects in other places, is that SMART offers a lot more flexibility in contracting and project configuration. An example of this is that under SMART, unlike under the SREC regime, a project can be installed without an off-taker. You don't need to match the production to load either on-site or in some or remotely in that load zone. You can actually sell directly to the utility, which is about as bankable of a proposition as you can imagine, and just receive a lease payment as a municipality. Again, I'm happy to get into specifics relating to the projects that you may have in mind, but if you were to take one thing away from sort of the economics of SMART, it might be a lower incentive, but there's a lot more flexibility available. Now let's talk a little bit more concretely about how to bring a project that might be an idea or sites that might have been identified for solar but are in the design phase and walk through some of the options. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of options under SMART, and many of these factors will be dependent on your municipality and your specific preferences, but this is a good starting point for considering a project that might fall under SMART. So for those on the line who were involved in projects under the SREC regime or even before that, there were certain sectors of solar development that really lagged behind others over the past 5 or 6 years. And two of those that we've identified here are community shared solar projects and carport projects. Those two project configurations were relatively difficult to finance due to higher costs both of the underlying technological components as well as higher cost of capital due to their risk profile. Due to SMART's structure and the relatively higher adder for community shared solar and carports, what we've seen so far is a lot more interest in developing in those sectors, which means that if you have experience in the past of developing community shared solar and carports, or maybe you ran into challenges during the SREC regime, do consider looking at those types of projects again, because the financing market and the ability to develop those projects may have changed for the better. We also mentioned here bundled rooftops. Generally speaking, the cost of solar is still coming down, and so what used to be marginal projects under SMART due to larger market forces like lowering technology costs, but also the surety that a fixed incentive provides, bundling municipal rooftops or smaller systems might actually be a lot more attractive under SMART than it may have been in the past. However, while we've identified some sectors that may see a lot more opportunity or a lot more development under SMART than under SRECs, there are still other sectors that are definitely lagging behind and will require a much more involved touch and a lot more municipal leadership to get them developed. And those are low and moderate income solar and small rooftops. Those remain the two most difficult types of projects to develop. And so, we're happy to walk through it, but that will take, an involved effort in order to get those developed under SMART. So now getting into maybe mapping out your next steps if you're considering a solar project. Where we typically start at cabinets with a municipality is defining project objective. This may seem fairly obvious, but there is a material difference to the manner in which you will develop a project if your main objective is energy cost savings or if your main objective is maximizing solar or increasing access. Your objective will really define the configuration, especially with more options available to you under the SMART program. And so we've outlined 3 different objectives here, which we have seen quite a bit. These are sort of the 3 main drivers of municipal solar development that we've encountered. The first is energy cost savings. This is, you as a municipality or decision maker has identified solar development as a method by which you can save your taxpayers money on energy costs. The way, to achieve that objective is either identifying municipal properties that can host solar or going out and finding solar projects that need offtake and offering the municipality and its load demands as an off-taker to offset your energy costs with discounted solar power. If you're looking into this, if this is your objective, it's important to consider which adders offer the most benefit and which projects offer sort of the maximum potential to developers. Those are the projects that you'll likely get the best contract terms and probably the most savings per dollar or per kilowatt hour. And second objective we see quite a bit is to just maximize the amount of solar on municipal sites. Generally speaking, larger projects are more attractive to developers because there are economies of scale. That's why if energy cost savings is your main objective, larger projects will be basically the most bang for your buck, so to speak. But if you're just looking to maximize the amount of solar, you can bundle smaller projects with larger projects, and while you may be saving slightly less per kilowatt hour, you will probably get more solar. And we've seen a number of municipalities deploy this strategy pretty effectively in the Commonwealth, and it's definitely something worth exploring, specifically if you have an energy management plan or a sustainability goal that you can match with solar, with hosting solar on municipal property. And finally, another very popular objective in the Commonwealth is increasing constituent access to solar. This often happens after a municipality hosts a solarized campaign, or there's a lot of outreach maybe in that city or town by the solar industry, which stirs up a lot of interest in solar, but maybe identifies a number of customers who can't host solar directly and look for alternatives to monetize or enjoy solar benefits. Oftentimes, in that scenario, municipalities and local community leaders are really looked to answer questions about how can you connect me, a homeowner who doesn't have the ability to host solar, to a solar project. This, you have a number of options at your disposal, but typically this means potentially leveraging a municipal site to host community shared solar, or using your role as a municipality to connect with community shared solar projects in the area. We can talk about this in more detail, but those are typically the three objectives that can be met in a variety of different ways under SMART. I'll breeze through this because for a number of you, procurement will be a bit of a review, but typically there are three pathways to developing solar in the Commonwealth. The first is 25A. This is a procurement pathway which allows a municipality to release an request for qualification or a request for pricing under the guise of an energy management service agreement. The 25A requires DOER approval, and it is a relatively long turnaround time. The principal benefit of the 25A, though, is that it does put a heavy emphasis on vendor qualifications and an investment-grade audit-level energy savings analysis. 30B is probably one of the major other pathway that we've seen used. You can only release, or you can only solicit bids through 30B by issuing a request for pricing. However, it is not subject to DOER approval, and is typically something that can be published more quickly. You do have more flexibility for evaluation criteria, but since it concerns real property, you're required to have a lease or pilot component to that document. Another important consideration with 30B is that, especially in a program like SMART, it's very important to have details, potentially assessor's maps, geotechnical analysis prepared for the sites that you have in mind, since in order to provide pricing, it's really nice to have private development be able to do some due diligence during the bid process. And finally, the third procurement option is worth mentioning is power options. Some of you may be familiar with power options, but it is a pre-solicited solar contract that has pre-vetted vendors so that you don't have to go through the typical procurement process. Municipalities will differ in their approach, but power options is a relatively fast process and can be a really good way to both get a quote for the type of pricing you might receive for a solar project without the obligation to buy. And finally, some specific considerations for procurement under SMART. Like I mentioned a couple times, there are a lot more creative approaches under SMART, and we're likely going to see them develop as the program progresses. So one recommendation that we typically have for municipalities trying to develop solar under this program is to not be totally prescriptive in your approach when putting a project out to bid. Take, for example, you really want solar on schools with a storage component. That's an entirely valid project configuration. But if you're putting it out to bid, it might be worth requiring pricing for a solar plus storage on a rooftop of a school, but then allowing developers to also propose their preferred method of development and an alternative approach. This just allows you more insight into the options that are available that might not be identified before issuing the solicitation document. Equally important, because SMART is a declining block incentive and is subject to a good amount of risk when it comes to where a project ends up, we really recommend municipalities ask developers for the assumptions and their inputs. So assumptions would be things like the SMART block for which the program will qualify, adder block, the energy storage revenue, and this also allows a little bit of insight into the developer's qualifications. The metaphor I typically use, which may be a bad one, is the SMART program, if you're looking at a project now, it's a bit like an airplane taking off, but you don't exactly know where the runway is, where you're going to land. And so digging into a developer's assumptions about that destination will get you a long way in being able to evaluate the bids fairly. The last two are quite important as well. The SMART program, like we just explained, has a good amount of risk because you don't exactly know where you will qualify down the road. But there are also things like interconnection timelines and qualifying for the federal investment tax credit, which is set to step down at the end of 2019, that will impact the project's economics and potentially jeopardize the project in certain circumstances. So asking for a developer's risk mitigation strategy is especially important. And finally, always worth repeating, balance the price and the qualifications of the vendor. In solar, when your project's economics are based on a declining block incentive, a low contract price or good savings on a PPA can only be actualized by well-qualified developers who are able to construct and commission the project in time. So it's really important in your evaluation criteria to equally weigh price, economics, and vendor qualifications. I think now we've got hopefully a good amount of time to discuss questions that came up, so I will throw it back to Nicole. Oh, sorry, actually no, not yet. So really quickly, and what I just described is mostly the third-party ownership approach. That approach it has been the approach taken by the vast majority of municipal entities in the Commonwealth thus far, but direct ownership is an option. It's just important to consider some of the factors and the differences in direct ownership and third-party ownership. Only private entities and taxable entities can capitalize on the investment tax credit and pass on those savings, and that's usually, so usually the economics are a lot better with third-party ownership. Collaboration of a municipality, financier, and developer just puts a lot more skin in the game. And so while your team right now that's looking at solar projects might be very dedicated and very engaged, who's to say if you were to own the system outright, in 10 years if an inverter failed, there would be somebody there to pick up the project, commission a replacement, and not treat that technological failure as a sunk cost that would take the project out of operation. That's something we've seen in the past with public ownership of solar and something you really want to create a plan for. There are some benefits, however, for direct ownership of municipalities, and that is that municipalities typically can raise capital at a much lower rate, and direct ownership does allow you total control of the asset so that you can fit it in and integrate it to long-term sustainability plans that may change over time. There's potential for a higher return, but of course, a lot more risk if the municipality is the only owner of the system. So, like we mentioned before, there's plenty of innovative approaches to this and something that we can dig in a little deeper during the question and answer phase.
Okay. So we've had some great questions that folks are writing in. So we're going to address those more or less in the order that we've gotten them. So the first question we had was, in the distinction between small and large projects, is 25 kilowatts in AC or DC? So that's in DC. No. Greg, are you? Okay. And that's the distinction for like larger than 25 kilowatts or less than 25 kilowatts. The second question we had was, can we provide some municipal examples of building types or energy storage pencils out? Haven't come across any yet that have the demand charges or demand response revenue potential that make it work. That's a great question. I don't know if we can answer that off the top of our heads right now, unless you'd like to get that one, Greg, but
yeah,
storage is something we're thinking about.
Yeah, that is a great question, and correct. Majority of municipal projects, those rate classes don't have high enough demand charges to allow for the best economics for energy storage. One thing to consider, though, is I think some folks treat energy storage as there's a lot of potential in energy storage revenue that's not quite actualized. So the economics may not pencil now, and I think that's the feedback you hear from most of the development community. If you don't have a high demand charge, it's harder to get solar plus storage to pencil. But there are the ancillary benefits of resilience that you may be able to quantify and may provide value in a specific scenario. And there's also likely to be more ability to generate revenue through alternative streams like the forward capacity market and some other options down the line. It's just those don't pencil quite yet. But great question. I think the assumption you made is correct, but it's worth following how energy storage can be monetized in the future.
And this is Nicole again, and I'd like to eat my words a little bit. So for the SREC2 extension, then that distinction is based on DC, but for SMART moving forward, that will be based on AC. The way to keep that in mind is like how that production looks when it's getting to the utility, because now both sides of that incentive, so your bill and the SMART incentive, are being processed through your electric utility. Okay, so our next question, our municipality is putting together a 15 to 20 megawatt hour low to moderate income focused community solar project. To creatively navigate the financial risk with our demographic, we were hoping we could have the ledger with credit sent directly to the developer. Is this a possibility?
Perhaps we get a little bit of clarification on what exactly that means, and maybe come back to it. Yeah, I guess I think there are, and I think you've outlined one component of serving LMI communities that is, I think, identified as an issue with SMART. It's that it's hard to deliver the economic benefit to folks on assisted rate schedules. And as such, I think folks are looking at innovative ways to deliver economic benefit that actually makes a material impact in those communities by not perhaps going through the traditional avenue. So that's probably a lawyer's question, but I think it's something that MAPC could definitely follow up on and discuss in greater length if we had a little bit more detail.
So our next question is, what are we seeing for municipal projects for, and I think this is alternative on-bill crediting amount. What are developers proposing right now?
Good question. It entirely depends. I think there's a large amount of, so for those who are familiar with the net metering program, net metering rates were for municipalities typically in the 10 to 20 cent per kilowatt hour range. The alternative on-bill credit has reduced the on-bill credit to more in like the 8 to 12 cent range. So the on-bill benefit is a lot less, but there's still a lot of variation depending on the project configuration on what the type of discount you would get. I would say it ranges between, again, just for that AOBC portion, it can be, you know, as much as 75% discount to more of like a 15% discount. I think, again, depending on the total compensation rate, I think it would be somewhere in that range. And happy to talk specifics offline.
And then our next question is about the National Grid net metering cap and what the impact of that cap will have on projects in that territory. So the first part to that, I think, is since this is time sensitive as projects come in to fill up these declining blocks, that will have an impact in how quickly the National Grid blocks fill up, since there is a bigger backlog of projects in that territory.
Yeah, and so because in National Grid currently you don't really have the option of net metering, most of those projects will migrate to alternative on-bill credit, which is an uncapped program, and qualified facilities, which is selling directly to the utility. So I think, you know, whereas in Eversource territory, you might get a more diverse range of some projects will be behind the meter and net metered, others will be AOBC, and others will be qualified facilities. I think it will just push development into the AOBC and qualifying facilities camp. The bigger issue in National Grid, of course, is the subscription in that utility territory is likely going to go the most quickly. And so I think right now, projects that are in the design phase or in sort of the brainstorm phase are modeled to land in around Block 6, which is towards the end of the program.
Okay. And then our next question is, how easy is it to add storage to a front-of-the-meter project later if storage prices come down further and it makes more financial sense? And for that, for SMART, there are some restrictions on adding solar capacity in particular. So there are some complications in adding components of the system later and then re-registering for the the program. So there are some restrictions to that that could make it a little bit complicated to have that incentive and to get that storage adder with a system that you've already applied for SMART under. We're happy to look into that further because I think that's a good consideration. Our next question is, with a smart building mounted project, can you net meter excess PV generated to other meters owned by the same entity? Does net metering credit work similar as under SREC? What is the approximate value for NMCs?
Net metering credits.
Net metering credits.
Yeah, so if you have a behind-the-meter system, you won't be able to credit those to remote accounts. And the value of the net metering credit would be dependent on your rate class, the retail rate for power in that class. But SMART is, so if there's net metering capacity available in your utility territory, you can net meter a behind-the-meter system in SMART, regardless of whether it's building-mounted, carport. You know, if it's installed behind the meter, you can access net metering, assuming that it's available in your utility territory.
Then our next question is, can you just please define alternative on-bill credits and when that applies?
Sure. So alternative on-bill credits is basically the SMART program version of net metering. And so take a lot of the elements of net metering credits, and then there are a couple changes. So where net metering credits are valued on the retail rate for power, alternative on-bill credits are valued at the basic service rate. Where net metering credits have their own specific cap, alternative on-bill credits are uncapped. You just have to qualify for the SMART program in order to access that option. They're an option for for systems under SMART, and they can be credited remotely within the utility territory. Another distinction between the net metering program and alternative on-bill credits is that they can be credited to any system within your utility territory, not just your load zone.
And the next question is, what if you have a project that's in the design phase right now and is planned to begin within the next 2 years? Will this program be of use? So the SMART program is designed for the next 1,600 megawatts of solar capacity in the state. So even though it's a time-based incentive in the sense that as projects come in for application, they'll be put into these capacity blocks that have the declining incentive. But after this first initial wave where we get through the backlog of projects, then we expect the program to proceed at a much slower pace after that point. So theoretically, this program will still be there for as long as it takes to get to that next milestone of capacity. So we are planning longer-term projects to be under SMART as well.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, from the developers with which I've spoken, depending on the utility territory you're in, National Grid is estimated to be, if you're just designing a system now, probably in block 5 or 6. WMECO is probably in that same, is going to be also one of the fastest moving, Western Mass Eversource is going to be one of the fastest moving blocks. But in Eversource, if you were starting now, it would probably be somewhere more along block 3. But it's also important to consider that the investment tax credit also steps down at the end of next year. So there are a bunch of deadlines to juggle.
And I would also add in there that if you have a project that's you're starting to think about now, or that's a little bit longer term, or in the design phase, then in the 400 megawatt review might be a good opportunity to add your comment and input to what the program looks like, because that is an opportunity that for the whole SMART program to be reviewed, and there's the potential for there to be changes in there based on the comments and feedback that are received. So that would be a good point to bring up projects like that are already in the work. Okay. So we're going to get to one or two more questions here, and then you're all writing in great questions, and we want to make sure that we can respond to all of these. So anything that we're not able to get to right now during this webinar, we'll be reaching out directly, and I'll be putting up a slide with some contacts at MAPC that you can reach out to as well. Okay, so our next question, is it this one?
Yeah, you want to do that one and then we'll...
Yeah. So our next question is, as a muni or public entity, can I opt to choose the solar canopy adder for an appropriate project? Is that correct? Are the adders competitively bid within each block? So for the second part of that question, the adders are not competitively bid. The adders have those fixed amounts and then decline at each block by 4%. The competitive bid process is the first part of the first block, and so that's already occurred, and that's how we set those initial base prices. So then in terms of which adders you can use inside each of those buckets, you can pick and choose which adder you would like to apply. So if you're a public entity and you have community shared solar, if both of those apply to your project, you can pick using community shared solar as your adder because that's a higher amount. So so you would pick whichever one will give you the higher total incentive, unless you want to make a statement by saying this is a public entity project. It most of the time it'd be in your best interest to just pick inside those buckets what adds up to the highest amount. Okay. Then our last question is, how can a municipality ever reach net zero carbon status if the utility automatically claims the environmental benefits of solar under SMART? That's a great question. So this is an area of consideration that municipalities are already looking at under SRECs, and a similar thought goes for SMART as well. So by participating in this program, the same as when you're participating in the SREC program now, you are giving up that ability to say that structure is being powered by solar energy. So if that is more important to you, or if that is the goal of the project versus making having the financial support of this program, then you might want to consider not participating in the SMART program and instead being able to claim that building is being powered by renewable energy.
And you also do have the option of buying back the RECs and retiring them. So it would eat into the economic benefit of the project, but you do have that option.
Yeah, and there is a difference with the length of time that those RECs are going to be there. So for these, I say smaller projects, but this is probably most of the ground-mounted projects that we're looking at. So for under the 25 kilowatt projects, those are for that 10-year period of time, and then only those larger projects have the 20-year tie-up for the program. So you can think about that in your timeline for getting to net zero carbon as well, and whether that works out with your plan.
Traditionally, too, municipalities have basically claimed if they host renewable energy or host a solar site, they can kind of claim that on their websites or other materials, whereas they can't claim if they're participating in this program or in the prior SREC program to have the environmental attributes from that array. But there are ways of still promoting what the community is doing, while it does not then get to offsetting or helping you in your greenhouse gas inventory accounting. With that, I think we're going to need to wrap up, so I'll turn it back to Nicole to close this out.
Yeah, so I included in here a slide with some contacts at MAPC that you can reach out to specifically about solar and SMART if you have some more questions after this webinar, or would like help with some of the resources that you're looking at and how to interpret those. I also want to point out that I added a slide in here with links to all of those calculators that I talked about, and the slides that CUER has given on the SMART program launch, and the summary slides back in April, and that application portal, and then some other resources that are just make this more digestible. And then the other thing I wanted to make sure I pointed out was that we are offering a solar technical assistance subscription. So if you start in the design phase, or if you're starting to work on a solar project and you really want some more in-depth technical assistance, you can reach out to me about the subscription program where you can work with Cadmus one-on-one as well. So I'll go back to the contact page. Thank you very much for calling in. We've had some great questions on here, and we'll take any of the other questions that have been written in and directly address those with you individually. And if we have some other great questions that we think it would be helpful for everyone to hear back from, we will follow this up with an email with the slides and the recording, and we can answer some of those in that space as well. All right, so thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll talk to you all soon.